The humidity pressed down like a wet blanket across the volcanic beaches of Guadalcanal that morning, mixing with the sharp chemical stench of burnt gunpowder until the air itself seemed toxic. Dean Wilson, a corporal in the United States Marine Corps, found himself wedged behind whatever protection a hasty arrangement of sandbags and fallen palm trunks could provide, his body still shaking from the violence that had just unfolded in the darkness. Stretched out before his position lay something that resembled a nightmare more than a battlefield. Hundreds upon hundreds of Japanese soldiers, motionless on the black sand, their once immaculate uniforms transformed into tattered, blood-soaked rags. These men had fallen victim to something they couldn't have anticipated, a weapon that would fundamentally alter how infantry fought in the Pacific theater. Wilson's gaze dropped to the Browning automatic rifle resting against his leg, its wooden furniture scratched and damaged from the desperate fighting. When the initial assault had come screaming out of the tropical night just hours before, he'd instinctively brought the weapon to his shoulder and pulled the trigger, expecting the familiar hammering recoil of 30 caliber rounds tearing through the darkness. Instead, he'd heard only the sickening metallic snap of a firing pin striking nothing. A malfunction at the absolute worst moment imaginable, yet that mechanical failure wasn't what occupied his thoughts now as the sun climbed higher. What truly disturbed him was the speed of his transformation, how rapidly his training had kicked in when he'd abandoned the useless rifle and drawn his machete, how efficiently he'd killed 3 enemy soldiers in hand-to-hand combat before their bayonets could reach him. The young man who'd grown up on an Ohio farm had become something else entirely in those few terrible seconds. Some distance across the killing ground, Marine Captain Charles Brush stood surveying the aftermath with emotions that wavered between disbelief and revulsion. His patrol of 60 men had stumbled into something far more significant than the reconnaissance mission they'd been assigned. They'd witnessed the beginning of a new chapter in warfare, the moment when American manufacturing capability and Japanese martial tradition collided with such force that only one could survive. The numbers painted a stark picture. Approximately 800 elite troops from Colonel Kiyono Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment now lay dead or mortally wounded, while only 34 Marines had made the ultimate sacrifice. But raw statistics couldn't capture the seismic shift in combat philosophy that had just occurred on this narrow strip of sand, lost somewhere in the vastness of the Pacific. What transpired at this location went beyond a simple tactical victory. It represented a revolution in military technology written in the blood of hundreds of men and forged in American steel. For the first time in the Pacific Campaign, Japanese infantry forces encountered a weapon system that would fundamentally reshape how battles would be fought from that day forward. The coordinated, overwhelming firepower of Browning automatic rifles distributed throughout Marine squad formations had arrived on the battlefield, and nothing would ever be quite the same. Wilson dragged his hand across his forehead, smearing black volcanic ash across his skin. Around his position, other Marines were beginning to understand the same revelation that was slowly crystallizing in his own mind. These 20-pound automatic weapons capable of spitting out 650 rounds every 60 seconds hadn't merely won a single engagement. They'd rendered the entire Japanese infantry tactical system obsolete in the span of one brutal night. As daylight strengthened, it illuminated a scene so devastating. The Japanese military leadership at their Rabaul headquarters would initially dismiss the reports as enemy propaganda or mistaken intelligence. One general would insist the accounts must be fabricated, unable to accept that their finest soldiers, veterans hardened by campaigns across China and Manchuria, masters of nighttime infiltration tactics, and adherents to the warrior code of Bushido, could be annihilated by American forces they considered soft and undisciplined. But Wilson, staring out across what Marines were already calling Hell's Point, understood a truth that would echo through every subsequent battle in the Pacific. The era of automatic squad-level firepower had dawned, and the old rules no longer applied. Understanding the magnitude of this tactical earthquake requires stepping into the experiences of the young men who wielded these revolutionary weapons. Walter O'Malley had barely reached 19 years old when the Marine Corps assigned him as a bar gunner with the 5th Division, but he'd already grasped something that would define his entire war. The weapon he carried represented far more than personal armament. It served as the foundation of his squad's ability to survive combat. O'Malley would remember decades later, his aged hands still marked by a small black nodule of Iwo Jima sand permanently embedded beneath the skin, that the BAR meant everything to his unit. When they'd placed that 20-pound rifle in his hands, they weren't simply issuing equipment. They were making him directly responsible for whether his fellow Marines lived or died. The Browning automatic rifle embodied a fundamental transformation in how American military planners thought about infantry combat. Where the bolt-action rifles that dominated the First World War required manual cycling between each shot, the BAR could maintain automatic fire at 650 rounds per minute when circumstances demanded it, or deliver carefully controlled short bursts when precision mattered more than volume. Each 20-round detachable magazine held 36 cartridges powerful enough to penetrate Japanese defensive fortifications, while the weapon's 24-inch barrel provided accuracy that Japanese light machine guns couldn't approach. But the truly revolutionary characteristic that set the BAR apart from previous automatic weapons was its portability. At 20 pounds fully loaded, a single Marine could carry and effectively operate it without requiring the multiple-man crews that traditional machine guns demanded. This meant every 12-man Marine squad could possess its own mobile source of concentrated firepower, capable of suppressing enemy positions during advances or holding defensive sectors with devastating effectiveness. The Japanese military possessed nothing comparable in their arsenal during 1942. Their Type 99 light machine gun, designed by the legendary Colonel Nambu, was technically sophisticated, capable of 800 rounds per minute from 30-round magazines. But it required a 4-man crew for effective operation and was conceived primarily for static defensive employment. Japanese infantry doctrine relied heavily on disciplined unit formations, expertise in night combat operations, and the psychological shock value of mass bayonet charges. These methods had conquered half the Pacific region and vast portions of mainland China. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki embodied this supreme confidence as he led his 800 elite troops through the oppressive humidity of the Guadalcanal jungle toward the American defensive perimeter. His men were seasoned combat veterans, toughened by brutal campaigns across Manchuria and China, indoctrinated in the ancient warrior code of Bushido that taught them to choose death over dishonor. They advanced silently through the tropical darkness, absolutely certain they would sweep aside the Americans with contemptuous ease. Ichiki's intelligence assessment proved catastrophically flawed. His reconnaissance elements had identified American positions, but they possessed no understanding whatsoever of what those positions actually contained. They observed Marines armed with rifles, completely failing to recognize that dispersed throughout the defensive line were weapons capable of delivering more concentrated firepower than entire Japanese infantry companies. Meanwhile, the Marines themselves were still developing effective doctrines for employing their technological advantage. The official tactical guidance was straightforward: 1 BAR per squad, supported by an assistant gunner and additional riflemen serving as ammunition bearers. But in actual practice, young men like O'Malley were learning through trial and error how to maximize their weapons' potential under combat conditions. O'Malley would later explain that mastering the BAR required understanding its rhythm, its personality almost. The weapon could certainly fire on full automatic, But doing so would exhaust your ammunition supply in mere seconds. The real skill lay in firing controlled bursts of 3 or 4 rounds at a time, making every cartridge count, because your entire squad depended on your ability to keep enemy heads down while they maneuvered into better positions. The physical burden was punishing. 20 pounds of metal and wood, plus additional ammunition, in the steam room heat of Pacific Islands. Many bar gunners developed a characteristic off-balance walking gait, their bodies unconsciously compensating for the constant asymmetric load. But they also developed something else, an almost spiritual connection with their weapon that went far beyond normal soldiers' relationship with his equipment. This intimate familiarity would prove absolutely crucial as Ichiki's troops approached the marine perimeter during the night of August 20th. The Japanese colonel radiated confidence. His men had overwhelmed Chinese defensive positions using identical tactics, and American soldiers carried a reputation throughout the Japanese military as being pampered, effeminate, and cowardly, lacking any stomach for fighting in adverse weather conditions or during hours of darkness. What Ichiki fundamentally failed to comprehend was that American industrial capacity had produced something unprecedented in military history, a squad-level automatic weapon that could be mass-manufactured and distributed throughout regular infantry formations. While Japanese forces relied on a limited number of specialized machine gun crews, every Marine squad now possessed firepower that previously would have required crew-served weapons and specialized training. The psychological preparation proved equally significant. Marines had been repeatedly warned to expect fanatical Japanese attacks, and they'd witnessed firsthand what Banzai charges could accomplish against unprepared defenders. The BR provided them with confidence, the concrete knowledge that they could deliver sustained automatic fire against massed infantry assaults. As the night of August 20th deepened, both forces completed their final preparations. Ichiki's troops meticulously cleaned their rifles and affixed bayonets, readying themselves for the close-quarters combat that had served them so effectively throughout their conquests across Asia. They whispered prayers to their ancestors and mentally prepared themselves to die gloriously in service to the Emperor. On the American side, BAR gunners performed their final weapons checks. O'Malley and men like him throughout the perimeter verified that their gas systems were clean, their magazines properly loaded, their reserve ammunition readily accessible. None of them realized they were about to participate in a revolution in how infantry warfare would be conducted. The stage had been set for a violent collision between two fundamentally different military philosophies. Japanese warrior tradition was about to meet American industrial firepower head-on. Individual courage would confront technological superiority. Ancient tactics refined over centuries would crash against modern weapons born from factories. Within a few hours, the jungle night would erupt in violence, and when the sun finally rose over Hell's Point, the Pacific War would be forever transformed. The question facing both sides wasn't whether the Americans would achieve victory. Rather, it was whether anyone would survive to tell the story of how warfare itself had just been permanently transformed. At precisely 2 o'clock in the morning on August 21st, the night sky above Guadalcanal erupted in an eerie green glow as a Marine fired an illumination flare high into the tropical darkness. What that flare revealed defied every expectation Colonel Ichiki had brought to the battlefield and would change the fundamental nature of Pacific combat forever. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers were crossing the narrow sandbar at Alligator Creek, their bayonets catching and reflecting the artificial light. They advanced in perfect parade ground formation, exactly as they had during campaigns in China, exactly as their training manuals prescribed. But Guadalcanal wasn't China, and the Americans waiting in defensive positions weren't the demoralized Chinese troops Ichiki's men had fought previously. Private Richard Harding crouched behind his hastily constructed defensive position, watching the approaching enemy force with a mixture of amazement and primal fear. He would remember years later how they could actually hear the Japanese soldiers walking along the beach toward their positions, talking casually among themselves. They hadn't even deployed scouts ahead of their main formation. The Japanese confidence was so absolute, their contempt for American fighting capabilities so complete, that they were advancing as if participating in a training exercise rather than a combat operation. That supreme confidence was moments away from encountering 20 pounds of American engineering brilliance. Corporal Dean Wilson brought his BAR up, feeling the weapon's familiar weight settle against his shoulder. All around him, other BR gunners were doing the same, each man responsible for a specific sector of fire, each one serving as mobile artillery for his squad. The Marines had absorbed a lesson that the Japanese hadn't yet grasped. Modern warfare belonged to whichever force could deliver the most firepower in the shortest time. Wilson squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. The firing pin struck an empty chamber with a metallic click that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence before the battle. His BAR, the weapon his entire squad depended upon for survival, had malfunctioned at the worst possible moment. Japanese soldiers were now halfway across the sandbar, their battle cries echoing across the water, and Wilson's primary weapon was completely useless. But this moment revealed where American training met desperate innovation. Without hesitation, Wilson dropped his malfunctioning BAR and drew the machete from his belt. What happened next would become legendary among Marines who heard the story. In the space of mere heartbeats, this farm boy from Ohio killed 3 Japanese soldiers in brutal hand-to-hand combat, his blade finding its mark with lethal efficiency. Yet Wilson's individual heroics, as dramatic as they were, paled in comparison to the mechanical devastation unfolding around him. Every other bar along the Marine defensive line was functioning perfectly, and the collective sound they produced was unlike anything the Japanese military had ever experienced. The Browning automatic rifle fired the powerful .30-06 cartridge at 650 rounds per minute. Each round carried sufficient kinetic energy to punch completely through Japanese body armor and continue traveling. When multiple BARs concentrated their fire on the same target area, the effect was nothing short of apocalyptic. Lieutenant George Cordeya watched the slaughter unfold through his binoculars, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. Japanese soldiers were being cut down in entire ranks simultaneously, their disciplined formations disintegrating under the concentrated automatic fire. Bodies piled upon bodies as succeeding waves of attackers stumbled over their fallen comrades in the darkness. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis would later write, describing the bar gunners at work, that it was fascinating to watch them bustling amongst the trees, pivoting and turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. It resembled a comedy of mechanical toys, something unbelievable, watching them knock over palm trees which fell slowly, flushing the running figures of men from underneath. But this wasn't remotely a comedy for the men pulling the triggers. For bar gunners throughout the Marine line, each burst represented a life-or-death calculation. Should they conserve ammunition or suppress the enemy completely? Should they use controlled fire or switch to full automatic? Should they aim for precision shots or deny entire areas to enemy movement? The Japanese response revealed the catastrophic depth of their tactical miscalculation. Colonel Ichiki had expected to face scattered rifle fire that could be overwhelmed through sheer mass assault. Instead, his men encountered coordinated automatic weapons fire that transformed their greatest tactical advantage, disciplined group movement, into a fatal liability. The tighter their formations, the more devastating the BAR fire became. Captain Tetsuro Sawada led the second company in a desperate flanking maneuver, attempting to get his men close enough to employ their bayonets effectively. This was precisely what Japanese infantry training had prepared them for. Close combat, where individual skill and fighting spirit would triumph over American weakness. But automatic weapons don't care about fighting spirit. As Sawada's men charged across open ground, they met interlocking fields of BAR fire that cut them down with mechanical precision. The psychological impact was absolutely devastating. These elite troops, accustomed to inspiring terror in their enemies, found themselves completely helpless against an impersonal technological force. Meanwhile, young Walter O'Malley, who wouldn't reach Iwo Jima for another 3 years, was absorbing lessons that would keep him alive throughout the entire Pacific campaign. His BAR crew worked with practiced efficiency. O'Malley fired controlled bursts, while his assistant gunner fed him fresh magazines in smooth rhythm. They'd learned to coordinate with other BAR positions throughout the defensive line, creating overlapping fields of fire that made Japanese movement virtually impossible. The weapon that made this possible weighed just 20 pounds, but it was fundamentally changing the entire nature of infantry combat. Unlike the crew-served machine guns that had dominated the First World War, the BAR gave every squad its own portable artillery. Marines could advance with automatic fire support, retreat while maintaining suppressive fire, and hold defensive positions with firepower that would have required an entire machine gun company just a few years earlier. As the night dragged on, Colonel Ichiki made increasingly desperate attempts to break through the Marine perimeter. He ordered his 70mm cannon and machine guns forward, trying to suppress the American automatic weapons. But the BARS were distributed throughout the Marine line rather than concentrated in a few positions. When one BAR position was temporarily suppressed, others continued firing without interruption. The Japanese were discovering something that would haunt them throughout the Pacific War. American industrial capacity had democratized firepower. Every Marine squad now possessed capabilities that Japanese commanders had assumed belonged only to specialized units. By dawn, the transformation was complete, but the killing continued. Japanese soldiers who had survived the night attacks found themselves pinned down in daylight, unable to retreat across the open ground of the sandbar. Bar gunners picked off individual targets with precision fire, their weapons functioning simultaneously as automatic rifles and marksman tools. The final act came when Marine tanks crossed the sandbar, working in coordination with Bar teams to clear the remaining Japanese positions. Lieutenant Leo Case's Stuart tanks provided heavy firepower, while Bar gunners prevented enemy infantry from getting close enough to employ anti-tank grenades. Case radioed back when ordered to withdraw. "Leave us alone. We are too busy killing Japs," his crews working with Bar-equipped Marines to eliminate the last pockets of resistance. When the shooting finally stopped, the statistics told a story that Japanese commanders would initially refuse to believe. Nearly 800 elite Japanese soldiers dead, only 15 captured. American casualties, 34 killed, 75 wounded. But the real story wasn't contained in those numbers. It resided in the psychological transformation of Pacific warfare. The Japanese Army's tactical doctrine, perfected over decades of continental warfare, had been rendered obsolete by 20-pound automatic rifles in the hands of American teenagers. The myth of Japanese invincibility lay shattered on the black volcanic sand of Hell's Point, victim of American engineering and industrial capacity. For the Marines, the lesson was equally profound. They possessed a technological advantage that could overcome Japanese numerical superiority and fanatical dedication. The Bar had proven that firepower, properly applied, could defeat fighting spirit. As Corporal Wilson cleaned the blood from his machete and examined his still-functioning BAR, he was witnessing the birth of modern squad tactics. Within 3 years, the Marine Corps would increase its BAR allocation from 513 per division to 867, recognizing that automatic weapons at the squad level represented the future of infantry combat. The Pacific War had just been fundamentally transformed, and both sides were only beginning to understand what that meant. The sun climbed higher over Hell's Point, illuminating a scene that would haunt both American and Japanese military thinking for the remainder of the Second World War. Corporal Dean Wilson sat beside his damaged BAR, methodically cleaning the weapon that had saved his life even when it failed him. Around him, other Marines were making a discovery that would reshape infantry doctrine forever. Their automatic rifles hadn't just won a single battle. They'd created an entirely new reality of warfare. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese forces proved immediate and devastating. Sergeant Sadunobu Okada, one of the handful of Japanese soldiers to escape the massacre, later described the experience in terms that revealed the depth of Japanese tactical miscalculation. They had expected rifle fire they could charge through with determination and superior fighting spirit. Instead, they faced continuous automatic fire from positions they couldn't locate or suppress. Their training, their experience, their entire tactical system meant nothing when confronted with this new reality. When word of the slaughter reached Japanese headquarters at Rabaul, the reaction was pure disbelief. One general insisted it must be a false report, unable to accept that elite Japanese troops could be so thoroughly defeated. But the reports were confirmed, and with them came a terrible realization. American industrial capacity had given every enemy squad capabilities that Japanese commanders had assumed belonged only to specialized machine gun units. The transformation extended far beyond mere tactics. Lieutenant Colonel John George, who would later author Shots Fired in Anger, captured the psychological dimension perfectly. He wrote that Nambu light machine guns caused him the greatest and most demoralizing fear he had known in all combat he had seen. But George was describing his fear of Japanese automatic weapons, weapons that required four-man crews and static positions. Now Americans possessed squad-level automatic weapons that were portable, reliable, and devastatingly effective. For the Marines, the lesson became doctrine with remarkable speed. The story Walter O'Malley told decades later revealed how completely the BAR transformed Marine infantry culture. Bars never left the front lines, he explained. When a Marine was wounded on Iwo Jima, his M1 Garand or M1 carbine went back to the rear for repair or replacement. But if the bar gunner was hit, the weapon was immediately handed to the next ranking member of his team, and the assault continued without pause. This wasn't merely about weapons maintenance, it was about the birth of modern squad tactics. The bar forced Marine units to reorganize around automatic firepower. By war's end, Marine squads would consist of 3 fire teams, each built around a BAR gunner with his assistant and ammunition bearers. The weapon that weighed 20 pounds had restructured how American infantry fought. The impact rippled across the Pacific theater with devastating consequences for Japanese strategy. Unable to match American automatic firepower in open combat, Japanese forces began their fatal evolution toward the fortress warfare of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The deep bunkers and extensive cave systems that would cost so many American lives represented, in part, Japanese adaptation to the reality of squad-level automatic weapons. They couldn't win firefights in the open, so they went underground. The industrial dimension proved equally crucial. American factories produced over 351,000 BARs during the Second World War, while Japanese industries struggled to manufacture enough Type 99 light machine guns for their specialized crews. Democracy democratized firepower. Every American squad received capabilities that Japanese commanders must carefully ration among their best units. Modern military professionals recognize the BAR's legacy in every squad automatic weapon deployed today. From Vietnam's M60 to contemporary squad automatic weapons, the tactical DNA traces directly to Marines who discovered that 650 rounds per minute in trained hands could stop a banzai charge cold. The weapon's 20-round magazine limitation, criticized by some historians, actually force the fire discipline that made American squad tactics superior to Japanese area fire doctrines. You couldn't just hold the trigger down and spray bullets everywhere. You had to think, to aim, to make conscious decisions about when to fire and when to conserve ammunition. Perhaps most significantly, Hell's Point demonstrates how technological advantages can amplify human courage, while simultaneously rendering human courage insufficient by itself. Japanese soldiers displayed extraordinary bravery throughout the Pacific War, charging into certain death time and again. But bravery alone cannot overcome systematic firepower advantages. Conversely, American industrial capacity meant nothing without Marines willing to carry 20-pound automatic rifles across Pacific beaches under enemy fire, willing to stand their ground when hundreds of screaming enemy soldiers charged out of the darkness. The Bar story continues today in every military that recognizes squad automatic weapons as force multipliers rather than mere support weapons. When modern infantry squads organize around automatic riflemen, they're applying lessons written in blood on Guadalcanal's black volcanic sand. The concept seems obvious now, almost self-evident. Of course you want automatic weapons dispersed throughout your infantry. Of course you want every squad to have its own source of sustained firepower. But in 1942, this was revolutionary thinking. The Japanese military, despite its sophistication and combat experience, had failed to grasp this fundamental truth. They'd maintained the old model where automatic weapons were concentrated in specialized units, parceled out like precious resources. The Americans had democratized it, putting automatic rifles in the hands of ordinary infantry squads. As Corporal Wilson finally rose from Hell's Point, his damaged BAR slung across his shoulder, he carried more than just a weapon. He carried the future of infantry warfare. The 800 Japanese bodies scattered across the sandbar represented the end of one military era and the beginning of another, written in .30-06 cartridges and marked by the distinctive hammering sound of American automatic rifles, changing warfare forever. The lessons learned that night would be refined and expanded throughout the war. Marines would develop increasingly sophisticated tactics for employing their BARs. They'd learn optimal firing positions, how to coordinate multiple BARs for maximum effect, how to balance sustained fire with ammunition conservation. Bar gunners became something of an elite within the regular infantry, men who carried extra responsibility and extra weight. They knew that in any firefight, enemy forces would try to identify and eliminate the BAR first, because silencing that automatic weapon could break the entire squad's defensive capability. This made being a BAR gunner simultaneously prestigious and dangerous. You were essential to your squad's survival, which meant the enemy wanted you dead more than almost anyone else. O'Malley remembered how bar gunners would sometimes try to disguise their weapons, wrapping the distinctive barrel in cloth or vegetation, anything to avoid being immediately identified as the squad's automatic rifleman. The weapon itself had its quirks and limitations. That 20-round magazine meant frequent reloading during intense firefights. The bipod attached to the barrel helped with sustained fire but added weight. The weapon's length made it awkward in jungle fighting or cave clearing. It was thirsty for ammunition, and bar gunners often carried twice as much weight in cartridges as regular riflemen. But despite these limitations, or perhaps because Marines learned to work within them, the BAR proved itself time and again. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, wherever Marines fought in the Pacific, the distinctive sound of BARS marked American positions. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to this tactical innovation. They tried massing their own machine gun fire, but their Type 99 guns were too few and too difficult to move quickly. They tried infiltration tactics, attempting to get close enough that automatic weapons couldn't be brought to bear effectively, but American defensive doctrines evolved to counter this. They tried nighttime attacks when visibility made aimed automatic fire more difficult, but Marines adapted with defensive positions that created interlocking fields of fire even in darkness. Every Japanese tactical innovation met an American counter-innovation built around the fundamental advantage of squad-level automatic weapons. The psychological warfare dimension cannot be overstated. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with concentrated BAR fire spread stories throughout their units. The Americans had magic guns that never stopped firing, that could cut down entire platoons in seconds. These stories weren't accurate, of course. BARs had to reload, they could malfunction, their gunners could be killed. But the psychological impact of facing sustained automatic fire was so profound that it generated near-mythical stories. For Marines, the psychological effect was opposite, but equally important. Knowing they possessed superior firepower gave them confidence, the belief that they could hold against numerically superior forces, that their technology and training could overcome Japanese fanaticism. This confidence manifested in countless small ways throughout the Pacific Campaign. Marines would hold positions that should have been overrun, trusting their BARs to make the difference. They would advance against fortified positions, knowing their squad automatic weapons could suppress enemy fire long enough for assault teams to close the distance. The bar became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of American industrial might, a physical manifestation of the idea that American technology and manufacturing could overcome any obstacle. When Marines cleaned their BARs, loaded magazines, adjusted gas systems, they were participating in a ritual that connected them to factories back home, to the entire industrial complex that made their tactical superiority possible. The Battle of Hell's Point, when analyzed through this lens, represents a pivotal moment in military history, not because it was the largest battle or the bloodiest or the most strategically significant in traditional terms, but because it was the moment when a new form of warfare announced itself with undeniable clarity. The age of the individual rifleman, where marksmanship and courage were the primary determinants of infantry combat effectiveness, was ending. The age of squad-level automatic firepower, where coordinated fire and technological advantage could overwhelm individual bravery, had begun. This transition would only accelerate as the war continued. By 1945, American infantry squads would be organized entirely around their automatic weapons, with riflemen serving primarily to protect and support the BAR gunner. This represented a complete inversion of traditional infantry organization, where automatic weapons had been seen as supporting the rifleman. Now the rifleman supported the automatic weapons. This organizational shift reflected a deeper truth about modern warfare that Hell's Point had revealed. Firepower, not manpower, would determine victory in industrial age combat. The side that could deliver more bullets more accurately in less time would win, regardless of individual courage or martial traditions. The Japanese military struggled with this reality throughout the war. Their culture, their training, their entire worldview emphasized individual warrior qualities over mechanical advantages. Accepting that American teenagers with automatic rifles could defeat elite Japanese soldiers with decades of training and combat experience required abandoning fundamental assumptions about warfare and human nature. Many Japanese commanders never fully made this mental transition, continuing to rely on tactics that had worked against the Chinese or in earlier campaigns, refusing to accept that the battlefield had fundamentally changed. This cognitive dissonance cost Japanese forces dearly throughout the Pacific. Again and again, Japanese infantry would attempt tactics that should have worked according to their training and experience, only to be devastated by American automatic weapons fire. The pattern established at Hell's Point repeated itself on island after island. Japanese forces would attack, often at night, relying on discipline and fighting spirit. American forces would respond with coordinated automatic fire that turned courage into carnage. The result was invariably the same: disproportionate casualties favoring the Americans and another incremental step toward Japanese defeat. For the individual Marines who participated in these battles, the experience was more immediate and less analytical. They knew their BARS worked, that they could trust their weapons to function when needed. They knew their training was effective, that the hours spent on firing ranges and in tactical exercises translated into battlefield effectiveness. They knew their industrial base back home was producing the weapons and ammunition they needed faster than the Japanese could match. These concrete realities mattered more than abstract discussions of military doctrine or tactical philosophy. When Japanese soldiers charged your position, you didn't think about the broader implications of squad automatic weapons. You fired controlled bursts, you reloaded quickly, you kept your barrel clear, and you trusted that your BAR would keep firing. As Corporal Wilson packed his gear and prepared to move out from Hell's Point, he wasn't thinking about how his weapon had changed warfare forever. He was thinking about cleaning the blood off his equipment, about getting something to eat, about writing letters home if he got the chance, about surviving the next battle. But history doesn't require participants to understand their role in larger patterns. Wilson and thousands of other bar gunners were reshaping infantry combat whether they realized it or not, writing new doctrines with every trigger pull, every magazine change, every sustained burst of automatic fire. The weapon itself would serve throughout the Korean War and into Vietnam, before finally being replaced by more modern designs. But its influence extends far beyond its service life. Every military that studies infantry tactics examines the BAR and the doctrines built around it. Every squad automatic weapon in service today traces its conceptual lineage back to John Browning's design and the Marines who proved its effectiveness in the Pacific. The fundamental insight that Hell's Point demonstrated, that portable automatic weapons at the squad level represent a force multiplier worth reorganizing entire infantry formations around, remains valid today. Modern militaries continue refining this concept with lighter weapons, larger magazines, better optics, more reliable mechanisms. But the core idea remains unchanged from that night on Guadalcanal, when Dean Wilson's bar, despite his own weapons malfunction and hundreds of other BARS along the Marine line, transformed Japanese confidence into Japanese casualties. Firepower wins firefights. Technology amplifies training. Industrial capacity enables tactical innovation. These lessons, written in blood on black volcanic sand, continue shaping how infantry forces organize, train, and fight. The sun was fully up now, burning off the morning mist, revealing the full extent of the carnage. Corporal Wilson shouldered his BAR one final time and moved out with his squad, leaving Hell's Point behind, but carrying its lessons forward into every subsequent battle of the Pacific War.